Okay, good morning and welcome back. So this episode, installment, whatever, we are going to be talking about the city of Los Angeles, which was one of the Union Pacific's fabled city fleet trains that ran between Chicago and the West Coast. Now I'm starting with the city of Los Angeles because I'm kind of doing this, quasi-series where I'm doing the LA to Chicago, Transcontinental train. So from after the Chiefs, we're moving on to the city of LA because it's the next most famous train, and then the next one will be the Golden State just to finish off this poor excuse of a series. So we'll just stay tuned for that. So this train, as I said, was briefly mentioned in the video about the Santa Fe and its Chiefs. The city of Los Angeles was actually the impetus for the Chiefs starting, and it was also one of the trains that kicked off the Streamline Rage and Streamline era as a whole. And this wasn't the first of the city trains to run. This was just one of the more famous ones, or at least more relevant to this excuse of a series that I have. And I'm not going to be doing the city fleet in chronological order, but I am going to talk about the transcontinental trains that ran from, as I said, LA to Chicago. And since I'm doing them in kind of that order, we'll be doing it that way. And then eventually I'll talk about some of the more other transcontinental city trains. I actually might just do a catch-all like Union Pacific train video to kind of catch up some of the minor parts of the city fleet and their other assorted passenger trains. So the Streamline craze was launched by the Burlington and the Union Pacific, which started running services with articulated trains between Chicago and Denver, which is the Burlington, and then Kansas City and Salina on the Union Pacific. These trains were the Train of Tomorrow concept, which is a video in and of its own right, which I have no idea when I would do that. It's not even on the drawing board yet. These trains had all their main accommodations that trains would at the time have had, including bedrooms, coach seats, food service, railway post office and baggage, and power cars. I'm going to kind of gloss over this because these deserve their own video and it's more engineering and less history, so I'm just not going to devote a lot of time to it because I'm not an engineer. These train sets were also out of service. Some of them were out of service by the 1940s and were generally replaced with standard trains. So the significance of this starting the Streamline era, but it was also a piece of equipment that didn't really last as long as most people think is also, but we do have diesel multiple units to this day, which are still around and are becoming far more popular in other parts of the world. So the UP built a few of these kind of trains that I'm going to be showing a picture of hopefully, and ran them. Primarily, it became the city of Salina, which ran between Kansas City and Salina in Kansas. And then they built 4 more train sets that were in service until 1953. But I can't tell for certain if they were trains in the train sets or trains in the DMU sets and the DMU style difference, or it's DMU style train. So just putting that out there, I'm not an engineer and I couldn't really find solid information on that. So we're gonna just kind of roll with it. But this is also an area that had a lot of experimental messes, so it's kind of just something I'm glossing over and possibly gonna put into a future video and not right now. So the Streamline set that's on the M, I think it's 10,001. I'm not really sure how they pronounce that. And eventually was assigned to the city of Portland. There was a second set that was assigned to the city of LA, the original city of LA, which is scheduled to only run 5 times per month. And this was in May of 1936, which is what pushed the Santa Fe to launch the Chief and the Super Chief, because the Chief was already running by then. And by 1938, the UP and the Chicago Northwestern ordered 145 cars from Pullman and American Car Foundry, which would be used on the budding city fleet. Bud cars, but budding as in flower. This would prove to be a boon since this order was delivered right before the Second World War and the restrictions on metal that went into effect when the war started. After the war, the frequency of the city of Los Angeles was increased until it became a daily train in 1947. The Union Pacific also launched a daily train to complement the city of Los Angeles, which was the Challenger. This was the budget train that ran with tourist sleepers and coaches. The Challenger was also launched during the Depression in an attempt to bring back passengers to the rails, which again, tourism and rail resorts will be a video probably a couple more down the road. It was advertised on this train you could eat 3 meals for $1 a day, and this train was made up of cars taken from the Los Angeles Limited, the former flagship between Chicago and LA on the Union Pacific, and this train was launched in 1935, about a year before the city of LA from what I can tell. The Los Angeles Limited was still running daily, and the second part of the Challenger was added, and it was dubbed the San Francisco Challenger, which ran to Oakland on the SP out of Ogden, and the original one was dubbed the Los Angeles Challenger. And there were a few extra Challengers added during the war, but from what I can tell, the San Francisco section was dropped, I think in 46 or 47, and the LA Challenger was the only one that kept going for any significant amount of time, and it was just called the Challenger after this. And one source I was looking at actually falsely claimed that the LA Challenger was the second section of the city of Los Angeles. They were not. 2 different classes of train. It's kind of like saying the Chief and the Super Chief were the same train, or the Chief, Super Chief, and El Capitan were all the same train when they really weren't, because branding and product, which is my wheelhouse, but whatever. It's a story for a different day. So following the war, the heavyweight Challengers were dropped from the schedule, and this turned out to be temporary since the Challengers were brought back in 1954 with streamlined equipment. And hopefully there's a picture of it up now. And then the Los Angeles Limited was also dropped around the same time. As time went on, the service went into decline. The UP did switch its partnership between the Chicago Northwestern to the Milwaukee Road between Omaha and Chicago because of declining track conditions and just the overall quality of the Chicago Northwestern. The Union Pacific was one of two railways that were really big on passenger trains, which is kind of ironic considering today they're not. And they wanted the absolute best for their trains. And unfortunately, they couldn't really switch to the Western Pacific for the Ogden to Oakland portion. They were kind of stuck with the SP, but I mean, if they could have switched, they probably would have as well. And the Challengers in the city fleet was generally combined with the Milwaukee Road's Midwest, Hiawatha, and other services that ran to Omaha. And as time went on, the city of Los Angeles, cities of San Francisco, Portland, the Challengers, and every other train would be combined into one long train dubbed the City of Everywhere. The train would also be split en route and added to a lot, and trains would be, as I said, broken off and sent to their various endpoints. And by this time, the city of Los Angeles and the LA Challenger ran as a continuous train and basically until Amtrak took over in 1971, which is a weird thing that they did back then. I mean, I don't really... It would be kind of like flying a plane that was only first in business class today and then having a plane with the same or similar number flying only coach. I don't really get why they did that with trains and why it just wasn't one train. It was a branding thing and a pride thing. So that's about all where I'm going to leave that because I just don't understand why they would do that. And normally this is also the point where I talk about Amtrak service over the line, and there presently isn't. A run between LA and Chicago over the Union Pacific. At one point there was the Desert Wind, which did run the line as far as Salt Lake City, where it swapped cars with the California Zephyr and the San Francisco Zephyr before it was rebranded the California Zephyr, but that's a different history lesson. And the original Desert Wind ran its 811-mile trip from LA to Ogden as a daytime train with Amfleet equipment. And as it became available, because the Amfleet equipment was basically had to get put everywhere in the system because they didn't really have modern equipment when they started out. And then it would exchange passengers and later through cars to the San Francisco Zephyr and then later California Zephyr. This train would leave LA in the middle of the day and connect with the Zephyr in like the early hours of the morning in Ogden. And then it left Ogden for LA at night and arrived in LA in the afternoon. And in 1990, the Amtrak in the state of California did attempt to relaunch service between LA and Vegas with the cancellation of the Desert Wind looming due to the Clinton-era budget cuts, and that just didn't work out. And at present, there is no service rail-wise between Southern California and Vegas, but there is Brightline trying to open up a service. Amtrak announced recently in its 2035 plan it also wants to try to resume service, and I think it was the X train, which is like a party train that also wants to try to run a train. And as of writing right now, Brightline is trying to sell bonds, start construction, and recent reports have shown that they haven't been, and they only have until December 1st before their quasi-municipal bonds are no longer quasi-municipal, as according to the state legislature of California. And either they're going to have to get involved again, but with the ongoing challenges on the coronavirus and the depressed economy and the lightning fires in our political system, it's just probably not going to happen, and who knows if it does or not. And short of the state getting involved, Amtrak California, which would require them to ditch, Amtrak, as I call it, JPA California, is not going to be running trains along the old City of LA route anytime soon, unless Brightline pulls off a miracle or gets the legislature to extend their bond selling deadline. But given how bad California HSR is going right now, the state getting involved with another high-speed rail project seems highly unlikely. So before we leave, I also forgot to mention the history portion of this podcast / narrated light show that I normally do. Normally I front load this, but this time I didn't because I was an idiot when I did the notes. So the line between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. So the line from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles was built by two different railroads between the 1870s and 1903. The Utah Southern, which was owned by the Union Pacific, started building south from Salt Lake City. This was a slow-going process, and construction actually stopped at Milford, Utah in 1880 when the Utah Southern was absorbed into the Oregon Short Line Railroad, which was another UP subsidiary. And if you've seen any of the other videos on this channel, or and we'll see this pattern in other videos, is that there's a lot of in this era, a lot of reorganization of subsidiaries and shell companies, because that was just kind of a thing back then. This was done in the era, I think it was the Harriman era of the UP and SP, which is something that again deserves its own video in the future. Anyways, construction stopped and didn't resume until 1899 when the line was completed to the Nevada state line, and the UP made its intentions to build the Southern California Clear. But in 1900, a man named William Andrews Clark bought out the LA Terminal Railroad and announced that he wanted to build to Utah, and he used his political savviness and support and connections to start constructing a line from Utah and between Utah and California. And as mentioned in the video about the Santa Fe and its chiefs, Harriman didn't like competition, and I think by this point Harriman was dead. I'm not really sure off the top of my head, and I didn't write in the notes because again I forget stuff sometimes. And basically did anything to prevent a competing railroad from being built, which comically in one instance involved parking a train where another railroad was going to build a crossover. So Harriman was going to do anything he could to prevent a parallel line being built by his railroad between Utah and Southern California. So Clark's Railroad started construction in the Nevada parallel to the UP, or at least where it was going to be. This led to another business war that ended in 1903 when the UP and the LA Terminal, or I think it was the LA and Salt Lake Railroad at this time, were essentially merged without legally merging, and they completed a line to Daggett, California in 1905. And the first train ran on May 1st of that year, and Clark negotiated trackage rights along the Santa Fe from Daggett to Riverside. And this meant that the UP could start running its own passenger trains between Chicago and Los Angeles, which started with the Los Angeles Limited, which started running almost immediately. And this was the heavyweight train that basically ran until I think 1954 is when it stopped running. And this train it took between 68 and 73 hours to go from Chicago to LA. Fun range, by the way. And it's really good to have a schedule with a 5-hour on-time range. That's always a good sign. And in 1926, the schedule was reduced to the standard 63 hours end-to-end, which I guess was standard before the Streamline era. So the LA and Salt Lake and UP essentially merged but didn't legally. What they did do is UP bought 50% of the ownership of the LA and Salt Lake Railroad, and then they worked in partnership. In 1921, the UP bought out the remaining 50%, and the LA and Salt Lake essentially existed on paper at that point until 1988, which means that the railroad legally existed, but it didn't run any of its own trains. And paper railroads were fairly common at this time. Many railroads did this to avoid dealing with a formal merger progress, since the ICC would generally say no unless you were politically connected and or corrupt, because again, this was the time where that was more common. And they did this to maintain competition in generally the most psychotic way possible, which was generally forcing companies to have subsidiaries instead of just having one consistent system, because again, having like one company own 5 companies and competing against another company that owns 5 companies is somehow more competition, because reasons. And they treated railroads like monopolies, which they were true. They were for a time, but they were treated like monopolies well past the point when they had trucks, planes, and cars as effective competition. So what railroads did was buy smaller railroads, make it a subsidiary, and effectively rent the smaller railway's trackage to the larger one. And the smaller one effectively owns nothing but the tracks and runs no trains. And the Western Pacific did this a lot with like the Sacramento Northern and the Tidewater Southern, though most of their existences. A few engines, from what I've seen in pictures, would be painted in the Western Pacific paint scheme, but have like Sacramento Northern or Tidewater and Southern put on it. But these companies effectively just existed on paper and owned the tracks, but didn't really run anything and didn't have any other business activities. And this was true of like hundreds, if not a few thousand companies in the country that at the time. And it's also in a similar way to like now, where you have like literally like 500,000 companies that exist in one building in Delaware. And after deregulation in 1980, the railroads basically through that decade formally absorbed most, if not all, of their subsidiaries or sold them off as short lines if they were surplus for their needs. And that's kind of where we're going to end this today, as we went through the history of the city of Los Angeles, how the line was built, current Amtrak services or other products along the line. And we're basically just going to leave it there. Hope you did enjoy, and we'll come back for the next one. Yeah, it's probably going to be a much shorter one than normal, as will be the Golden State route. Anyways, see you in the next one.